The Waco History Podcast is sponsored by Brotherwell Brewery on Historic Bridge Street in Waco.
Cross the Brazos at Waco, ride hard and I'll make it by dawn. Cross the Brazos at Waco, I'm safe when I reach San Antonio.
This is the Waco History Podcast. Welcome to the next episode, and we have Ashley Bean Thornton with us today. And you could know Ashley from a lot of different angles. She's done dozens of walks around town. How many walks are you up to, Ashley?
Oh my gosh, I have no idea.
Yeah. So if someone's listening and they're going, wait, what are these walks? How would they find out about? Because you always have new ones upcoming.
Right. Well, it's called the organization, and I'm doing air quotes around that. It's called Waco Walks, and it's a spinoff from Act Locally Waco. So the most dependable way to find out about it is to go to the Act Locally Waco website, actlocallywaco.org, and there's a Waco Walks tab. But there's also Waco Walks on Facebook.
Okay.
So those are the two best ways.
And I know you do the tornado walk every year.
Right.
But there's always a variety of different walks that you've done. Some more historical, some more talking about current plans for Waco and things like that. And so the other thing that you might know Ashley from is Act Locally, which was her brainchild, right?
Right.
So talk about the genesis of Act Locally and kind of when that started.
Well, it came out of. I had kind of a life-changing experience having to do with Hurricane Katrina, and that spurred me to get more involved in the community. But I was working at the time, so I needed to find something that I could do in odd hours. And that just happened to be the same time that web pages were getting to where normal people could kind of do them, and a lot of things were coming together, and it seemed like a good time to start community calendar of all the different things that were going on around town. Waco was really on the cusp of having a lot more things to do, and there were a lot of nonprofit things going on, and that seemed like a little niche that I could step into and help with and use my time productively. So that's how it got started.
Well, do you mind sharing the Hurricane Katrina? The oral historian antenna in me went up. I want to hear the Hurricane Katrina story.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, my family's from the Gulf Coast. We moved around a lot when I was little in the Mississippi, Louisiana, and then finally Texas, mostly on the Gulf Coast. And so when Hurricane Katrina happened, it pulled at my heartstrings because we had lived in Slidell for several years, which was right down there. And our church students, our youth group, used to go to this camp called, I can't remember the name of it now. Passport was the name of the camp. And so in that particular summer youth camp usually always had some kind of work component, missions component. And so not the year of the hurricane, but the next year, the work component of that camp was to go to New Orleans and help with Hurricane Katrina cleanup.
I see.
And my husband's a school teacher, so a lot of times he gets recruited to do summer things because he has time in the summer, and he recruited me to go with him on this particular trip. And so we went down there, and the group that kind of organized our work in the 9th Ward, which was kind of the lower income part of town that had just been absolutely mowed flat by the hurricane, was this group called Acorn that did a lot of good work in the city, later fell into some disrepute in some other cities, I think. But in New Orleans, they were doing some fantastic work. And they did a really good job not only of organizing our work, but also about talking to us about the situation in New Orleans. And they just pretty bluntly pointed out, this was a year later, right? And so they pointed out in the well-off parts of town, things are looking fine. There was damage, but it's mostly been repaired. People are going about their lives. In kind of the middle-income parts of town, likewise, things were a lot better. People were settling back in and getting their houses repaired and that kind of thing. But in the 9th Ward where we were, it was as if the hurricane had happened the week before.
Yeah.
I mean, there were still cars up in trees. They warned us to wear our full hazmat into the houses because the refrigerators hadn't been opened in a year and no telling what was in there. And I mean, the reality of it was just stark.
Yeah.
And so since it was youth group, we were having these little confabs in the evenings where we would talk to the kids about, what'd you do today and how did that strike you? And one of the students who had gone with us mentioned, well, they keep talking about poverty and all these things in New Orleans, but it's just as bad in Waco.
Mm-hmm.
Well, we had probably lived in Waco at that time maybe 10 years or so, and I just really hadn't thought anything about that. I was working mainly at Baylor by that time and just going back and forth from home to work and not really paying much attention to my surroundings. Well, when I got back home, that really kind of struck a chord with me, and I started doing a little bit of research, and sure enough, that was a pretty accurate description that the poverty level in Waco was about like it was in New Orleans. And I just started learning more and more about it. I had never really been involved in community stuff growing up. We didn't. I guess it's a little bit ironic to say we did a lot of stuff at the church, but not much in the community.
Yeah.
And that was just very different back then.
Mm-hmm.
I think churches are more involved in the community now, or some are. And so I just didn't know much about that, but I learned a lot. I started going to a lot of meetings and meeting a lot of people. And in the midst of doing all that was when I figured out, well, I can vividly remember going to one meeting. It was a meeting of different groups that had food pantries. And at the end of the meeting, we were running around the circle. It was about, 8 or 10 people. And everybody told, what events they had coming up. And I remember it was like, well, February 2nd, we have this big event. We're doing this and this and this. And then the next person said, oh, well, we've got our big deal on February 2nd too, and going around the circle and it just struck me that it'd be nice to have a calendar with all that stuff on it. Mm-hmm. And so that's how Act Locally Waco got started.
Well, I would encourage folks listening to sign up for the Act Locally and the Friday update. I rely on every week to know what's going on that weekend. And I know you've been involved in reading clubs in the schools.
Right.
You've book clubs. I know y'all are always reading a book, it seems like. And so just Ashley's very involved out in the community. So I appreciate you talking a little bit about that. That's not what you came to talk about.
That's easy for me to talk about.
Yeah. So I asked Ashley to come in and visit. Ashley and I have a common bond in that we run into each other at Whataburger for breakfast every now and then. And so if my wife's listening, that's why I skipped breakfast at home. I went to Whataburger. So she's not listening. But when I saw Ashley last time, I've been wanting to have her on the podcast, and Ashley did a presentation last year for a Historic Waco Foundation on the kind of history of hotels in Waco. And so she did a lot of research on particularly hotels in the downtown area, Waco proper.
Right.
And hotels have become such a big part of Waco's present right now.
Right.
I mean, occupancy rates and things like that are talked about in a way that I don't remember us talking about them 10 years ago. And so I'm interested just if you can kind of give us some of the history of, Waco's always been this crossroads, but how we've kind of welcomed the stranger in these hotel spaces over time. Talk a little bit about some of the things you found in your research.
Well, like you're saying, I focused mainly on downtown and specifically really on 5 hotels. And one of the most interesting things to me was Jill Barrow, who was running the Historic Waco Foundation at the time, was the one who asked me to do this. Well, I didn't know anything about hotels. I don't have any particular experience with that. And I had never really thought about the role that a hotel plays in a city before. And so that was just kind of interesting to think about. I mean, I always just think of it as a place for me to stay when I'm going to another city. But really, hotels, maybe more in the past than now, but I don't think so. I think probably still today are not. I mean, just think of all the different associations you have with a hotel. Of course, traveling, but also, think of all the mystery movies you've seen where it's either a seedy hotel or a ritzy hotel and all these clandestine meetings are occurring. And then also hotels are a lot of times a big political place where a lot of political wheeler dealering happens. I mean, the Watergate Hotel, and I mean, and they're a way for a city to welcome the stranger, like you say, but also to meet with itself. They're a lot of times they're a community place. A lot of times that's where people go. A lot of times that's where nice restaurants are, or where you can go for music and dancing and that kind of thing. A lot of times that's a hotel. So I hadn't really thought about all of those different things. And then also, I think kind of my theme for the presentation was kind of bearing witness to the town.
Yeah.
You know, these 5 hotels kind of ranged over more than 100 years of Waco history. And so one of the interesting things to me was just to think about how they bore witness to that history and how a lot of it happened either in the hotel or around the hotels. Or so it turned out to be really interesting, a lot more interesting than I realized it was going to be. I mean, I guess my initial interest was just how pretty the buildings were.
Yeah.
I mean, there were some really amazing hotel buildings.
Well, you're giving a good teaser there. So, I'm going to ask at some point how you picked the 5, but that's probably a question we ought to save a little bit. So, what would be maybe the first hotel that you started with to kind of start looking at kind of this story of hotels in Waco?
Well, the first one that I looked into was the McClelland Hotel, which was, I had always had this little curiosity about it because of the walks. Because when we do, I mean, we've done several kind of downtown history walks, and we always talk about, you know, where Dr. Pepper was invented. And so we're standing right there where the Tornado Memorial is now, you know, and there's a little plaque in the ground there that says this is where Dr. Pepper was invented. But the Old Corner Drugstore where Dr. Pepper was invented, I knew from a picture I was looking at, was in the first floor of the McClelland House Hotel. And but in the different things I had read that the Roosevelt building now, but was a hotel, was built where the McClelland House Hotel was, but that couldn't be because
that's catty corner.
Because it's catty corner, and so one of the first things I did was learn about the McClelland Hotel, and turns out was connected to the Roosevelt Hotel, which is kind of a very interesting little Waco history story. But it was, in fact, at the place where the Tornado Memorial is. That's where the McClelland House Hotel was, which was was the first big hotel in Waco. And it was probably the biggest hotel in Texas for a while.
So by beds, like how many beds would the McClelland House have?
I want to say 200 rooms.
Oh my goodness! So a big hotel.
I have that written down somewhere. But it was a huge hotel. One of my favorite things, I brought some of my notes here so I can read to you. But one of my favorite things in doing this research was reading all the different little newspaper articles and things like that about the different people in hotels and things, because the journalism back then tended toward a more flowery style than we're used to. And so this is, it was 103 rooms. Okay, 4 stories high, 103 rooms was the McClelland House.
And what
Hotel.
year?
1872.
Okay.
So you think about the suspension bridge in 1870. This was 1872 during Reconstruction, and all those times the Chisholm Trail still cooking, like you say. So it was busy times, but I love this little quote about it. This is from John Sleeper, who was one of the people who was very good about writing things down back then. I guess he was one of our first historians. But anyway, he describes it this way. He says, Fulton, when he launched his boat upon the waters of the Hudson, was thought a fanatic, reckless in expenditures, and needing a guardian to prevent self-ruin. Mr. McClelland, when he removed a comfortable frame residence, dug up by the roots large shade trees, and laid the foundation for that mammoth hotel, the McClelland House, was thought by the populace to have overdone the thing very considerably. I just thought that was a great description. Because I can just see people, here he's digging up these trees and knocking down this house, and the people in the street are just going, this guy is a
Yeah.
lunatic.
He's lost it.
Yes.
Well, right
he
there
hadn't.
in the heart
Yeah.
of Waco. Yeah, right there in the heart of Waco.
Right. You could see everything from there. You could see the town square from there.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah, that wouldn't have. I mean, the town square would have been at the end of that block.
Right.
At
Right.
the end of that
Yeah.
block. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So when you said you were interested in kind of the buildings, but you began to discover the stories,
Right. Right.
and the personalities. Were there
Right.
some attached to the McClellan house?
Oh, yes.
Tell me about those now.
Well, I mean, just to stick with Peter McClellan
Yeah.
for a little bit, he was involved in a lot of things, not just hotels. I think he started out as a grocer in other buildings. I mean, a lot of the movers and shakers back then had their fingers in a lot
Yeah.
of different pies, and I guess still do now. But he really did. And when he died, he was probably the richest man in McLennan County.
Mm.
I mean, he was so rich that they reported on him dying in the New York Times.
Oh, wow.
I mean, it was big news all across the country. And one of the things that was big news about it was that he left his fortune to his second wife. I don't know what happened to his first wife. I guess she died. I don't know that for sure. But his second wife and his son by the first wife. And his son was Peter McClellan Jr. Well, here's this fabulously wealthy man, and in his will, he said that they would both, the wife and the son, would both get an allowance, basically. So the son was to get $150 a month for 25 years. So he was already 32 when his dad died. So he was supposed to get $150 a month for 25 years, which is not chicken feed, but was not what the son was expecting, I'm sure.
Mm-hmm.
And there was also a little codicil that was added to the will in like the last months of Peter Sr.'s life, saying that he would get the rest of the fortune either at the end of the 25 years or whenever the trustees of the will decided that he had attained the discretion to manage the estate responsibly. Well, okay. So
Yeah.
young Peter Jr., flipped out, just immediately started legal proceedings to break the will and to get his fortune ahead of that time. And, said, that his father in his dotage had been convinced by these disreputable characters to, put this in his will. And he was a very responsible person. And, most of what I read agreed with that he was a very responsible person. And why didn't he end up getting the fortune more quickly?
Yeah.
But so there's kind of two branches to this story. So one branch is that maybe his dad knew him a little better than he thought he did, because a few years later, so Mr. Peter McClellan Sr. dies, I think, in, 1900, something like that. And a few years after that, I could look and find the exact dates, but a few years after that, Junior's wife sues him for divorce. And about a year after that, because it turns out the courts move really slowly, they have the actual jury trial. I didn't know divorces resulted in a jury trial.
Yeah.
But one of the people who testified at the trial was Josie Bennett, who was described in the paper as a woman of the town.
I see.
But was one of the more famous madams from the reservation. Who said that Peter Jr. had come to her with advice about how to poison his wife or how to set up a gun so that it would discharge and kill her. And so Mrs. McClellan Jr., Dora, thought that would be good grounds for divorce. And so she sued him.
It's kind of petty, really.
Over that, I know, right? But it didn't. It was a hung jury. It was 6-6. So she didn't end up getting her alimony that she was requesting, and I guess people didn't necessarily think Josie Bennett was that good of a reference. But anyway, so Peter Jr. continues to contest this will, continues until, for 40 years he fights the will. And finally, in, I think, 1924, 1925, something like that, he finally breaks the will and inherits the fortune, that's been kept by trustees all this time. And 2 weeks later, he dies. So he doesn't ever.
So what's the moral of the story?
Well,
what's
I'm
the
not
lesson
sure. That's to be pondered by wiser heads than mine. But anyway, he ends up how this connects to the Roosevelt Hotel, which is catty corner to where that building is still here today, to where the McClellan building was, is that land was part of the estate. And it had already, by previous arrangement, it had been arranged that if Junior won his court case, that land was going to go to the lawyer, one of the lawyers, as part of the payment. So the land goes to the lawyer. The lawyer dies 2 weeks later. So
wow.
I didn't get it either. So the lawyer's widow and the other lawyer who was in on it end up selling the money to this organization called the Waco Development Company.
Selling the land?
Selling the land to the Waco Development Company. They go in cahoots with Conrad Hilton and build what's now called the Roosevelt Building.
Oh, wow.
So.
Okay.
Yeah.
So and then how long does the McClellan house stand? When is it? Is it there until the tornado?
No, it stood until 1916 and then it burned.
Okay.
It was, it went through a couple of name changes. It was, I think when it finally burned, it was called the Interurban Hotel.
Okay. Which had been completed and I guess would run right by it there.
Right. Yeah. And so, but it burned down in 1960,
Okay.
which was a common fate for a lot of these old hotels.
Mm-hmm. So does that transition us to the Roosevelt as your second hotel?
Well, the Roosevelt was actually the last hotel that I talked about because it's the newest of all the hotels. But they were probably the first 2 that I learned about, and it's an interesting, beautiful hotel. It was built so this Waco Development Company hired Conrad Hilton at the time had bought and refurbished one hotel in Dallas. He's from New Mexico, I think. But he had bought and refurbished a hotel in Dallas or Frisco or someplace up in the Dallas glob. And then he had built one hotel from the ground up at that time. So this, what was the Hilton, Waco Hilton, was the third Hilton Hotel in the Hilton Empire, I guess. And so he, went into partnership with this Waco Development Company. They bought, this is right during the time, let's see, so this was in the 1924. So the Cotton Palace was still going strong, and that's where a lot of people, and when the hotel opened, in 1928, the hotel opens and there's like this huge, celebration, and the newspaper runs like a 20-page special section on this new grand hotel that's opening up, and it has all these stories on every possible thing you can imagine, the electrical system and the coffee shop and all of these things, and every, the history of hotels all the way from Pompeii to the present, and, all this stuff about how excited everybody is about this big hotel, and then all of this, this is the centerpiece of all the growth in Waco, and all these articles about all these new things that are coming to Waco, and new industry, and new schools, and new homes, and new businesses, and all this stuff. And everybody's just ecstatic about it. It's so ecstatic. When you look at the pictures in the section in the paper, the hotel itself is only about half the size that it is now. And then even before they finished building it, he added on another 200 rooms. And you can see, if you look at the Roosevelt building now on the side, you can see kind of the seam where the two...
That annex that was built
right. Well, it's
interesting.
slightly different color brick, and you can kind of tell the difference. But anyway, it was all this hoopla and da-da-da, and Waco is, on the map, and la-la-la-la. And then, of course, now looking back on it, we know that 2 years later, the Depression and all of that just went kaflooey, And so Conrad Hilton ended up getting behind on all his payments. The Waco Development Company took back over the building, and they reopened it as the Roosevelt. And that's another thing that's interesting, looking at the newspaper articles about it. Because now, everybody has such mixed feelings about whoever the president is, right? But then it was like Franklin Roosevelt, the greatest man on earth. That's who they were naming the hotel after. And of course it became, the fancy schmancy hotel in Waco, and they did pretty well with it, even, despite the Depression and despite cotton kind of tanking and all that kind of stuff. They, it's such a beautiful building, still a beautiful building now.
It is, and they did a great job with the remodel on that building. Rick Tullis, had him in to talk about air conditioning in Waco, and I know the common spaces in the Roosevelt were air conditioned, which was part of the wonders, I guess, of the Hilton, the Hilton, not the Roosevelt, but
soundproof coffee shop. I thought that was kind of intriguing. Like,
why?
But,
I mean, is that? I guess the train's not terribly far away. I mean, is that?
Yeah, maybe. I don't know.
Okay, so those were your bookends.
Right.
So the McClellan and the Roosevelt. What were some other hotels you researched?
Probably my favorite one, the one that I thought was most interesting. I mean, they were all interesting, but they were mainly interesting for the things that kind of happened around them. Like the Pacific Hotel, right in front of the Pacific Hotel was where the Brand shooting was. And the Metropole, the Pacific Hotel became the Metropole Hotel. And then the Natatorium, that got to be a big deal because of the artesian waters and the spa and all that kind of thing. I mean, those were very interesting. But probably my other favorite story was the story of what became the Raleigh Hotel, which is the other one that the building is still here. Of the five I talked about, let's see, the McClellan, the Pacific, the Natatorium, the Riggins Raleigh, and the Roosevelt. The building of the Riggins Raleigh and the building of the Roosevelt are the only two that are still around, even though those buildings are not hotels anymore. But the Riggins Hotel, so there was this man who lived in Waco. His name was J.W. Riggins. And he came to Waco. I think he was a Presbyterian minister at first, and he came to Waco, but he couldn't make any money doing that. But his brother was already here, and they went into business at a hardware store, but they went broke, and he only had $10 to his name. And then they started some kind of, I don't know, I could never tell what kind of business it was, but it was a business that involved trading things. And so they would, and so he made a bunch of money doing that. And he was very politically involved, and eventually he ran for mayor. So he ran for mayor. I'm leafing through my notes here so I can get all the dates and things right. So he ran for mayor in 1900 and beat Champ McCullough, who was like super popular at the time. And then he ran again in 1902 and beat Felix Robertson, I think was his name, who was a well-known Confederate war hero. And but the 1902, right after the 1902 election, he was impeached by the city council, which I didn't even know you could do that. And evidently he didn't know you could do that either because he sued the city council on the grounds that you can't impeach me. There's no rules about how you can impeach me. And so that was tied up in the court for a while, but finally the court agreed with the city council, and they commenced an impeachment trial, and he did get impeached. And so that meant they had to elect a new mayor. So there was 7 days of electioneering for who's going to be the new mayor. And one of the things he was impeached for was because he didn't pay the city attorney, Well, he was impeached for all kinds of, incompetence and this, that, and the other. And one of the evidences that he was incompetent was that he hadn't paid the city attorney. He always claimed that he was being impeached because he was anti-prohibition. And a lot of the movers and shakers in town were very passionate about prohibition.
I see.
And but anyway, the city attorney was who ran against him. And so there's all this super, hyper electioneering with people riding around town on horses from election spot from voting place to voting place, campaigning and this, that, and the other. But eventually he loses. So J.W. Riggins loses. The city attorney becomes the mayor. Riggins packs up and moves away to California. So he moves to California. This is 1902. He probably moves 2 or 3 years later and makes his fortune in California. So he comes back about 1910, and he's kind of, hanging around Waco. And by this time, I think that's the very year that the Cotton Palace got up and going again after it had burned down. So all of these, the city fathers, or the Young Men's Business League, is like, we need a new hotel because all these other hotels are starting to get kind of old. So they put up a $50,000 prize money to whoever will build a new hotel. Well, Riggins had been a hotel guy. He had managed the Pacific Hotel for a while, so he had some experience with hotels, and he had made his fortune in California. And so he comes to the city leaders and he says, look, I am still bitter over being impeached, and my whole family has to deal with the shame of this, and the only way that I can regain my good name is if I'm elected mayor again. And he says, so if you will help me get elected mayor, I will build your new hotel. And so that's exactly what happens. They help him get elected mayor. He collects the $50,000 from the Young Men's Business League. He plans this modern, fireproof brick modern hotel. He figures it's going to cost about $350,000 to build. He builds it. It ends up costing about twice that much.
Oh, wow.
So he goes completely bankrupt, loses all his life savings. He ended up serving out his time as mayor, but then he ends up leaving town again and ends up moving back to California. So one of his creditors was this place called the Albert Pick Hotels. So they ran hotels, but they also did things like, selling people their furniture and silver and all that kind of stuff. And so they were one of the creditors, and they ended up buying the hotel. So they bought the hotel. Well, everything had a big R. It was called the Riggins Hotel, named after him. And everything had a big R printed on it. All the linens had R on it. All the china, everything had this big R on it. So they wanted to keep the R because they didn't want to get rid of all that stuff. But they did not want to be associated with Mayor Riggins. So they changed the name to the Raleigh Hotel. And so it was the Raleigh Hotel. And that hotel, it stayed a hotel into the 80s. I mean, it was built in 1914. It was a hotel into the 80s. But again, I just want to read this one other little quote from the newspaper. So this was a guy writing in the newspaper actually in 1913. So Riggins is raising all this money, and everybody's like, yay, Mr. Riggins, he's so awesome. He's going to build our hotel. But this one crabby journalist in the paper just sees the ill wind blowing. And this just cracked me up. He says, all this applause, all these pats on the back from those who stand in the wings while Riggins is in the spotlight will butter no parsnips for him, nor cool his fingers when the chestnuts are out of the fire.
Oh, my goodness.
I'm not even really sure what that means, but I just thought that was hilarious. So sure enough, he goes broke, has to move away. The hotel stays, and it was like the hot swinging place. Well into the 40s. The main highway, you could see the lights of the Raleigh Hotel from the main highway. So a lot of people traveling stopped through there. That's where Elizabeth Freeman stayed when she
okay.
came to research the Jesse
Washington
lynching. That's where Gussie Oscar lived when she was running the Waco Auditorium. Eleanor Roosevelt stayed there. Probably the most famous person who stayed there was Babe Ruth when the Yankees came to town to play at Katie Field. Babe Ruth stayed there. My little quote from that I think is so cute is the man who had the barber shop there. Let's see, his name was Julius Marock. He said, "The Babe had the biggest head I ever shaved." So, and then another one, Admiral Richard Byrd stayed there.
Oh, wow.
And a little quote from the guy who had the shoe shine stand there. His name was Booker T. Dunn. He said he began shining shoes in the Raleigh barber shop in 1931 and worked there till it closed in 1984. He remembered shining the shoes of Admiral Richard Byrd, the famous Arctic explorer. When asked what he thought of shining the shoes of someone so famous, he said, "He only gave me 15 cents. I'd rather shine yours."
Not a big tipper, Admiral Byrd.
No. So I thought that was great. But the hotel, actually, like I say, it was a hotel till the 80s, but it became more like a residential hotel. A lot of low-income people stayed there. When the highway opened up, a lot of the hotels kind of went downhill because all the traffic moved to the highway, and motels started becoming popular. And eventually it was kind of a there's this one guy who said, "Yeah, there were too many rats there," which made me think, well, I wonder how many rats would have been enough. Yeah. Would have been fine. But anyway, during the 80s, it was a big, are they going to tear it down? And then other people were like, no, it's historic. We need to try to, preserve it. And it went back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. Finally, the Downtown Waco Corporation made, I guess, an agreement with David Sibley when he was in the Texas Senate to consolidate all the state offices into that building, and that's why it's still there now. But you can go there still and pull back the utilitarian little entrance rug, and it still says Raleigh on the tile.
Yeah, that R is still in there. Yeah. So that 8th and Austin, so just so folks can think of where that is.
So that was the furthest out hotel that I looked at. And a lot of people thought, oh, my gosh, who's going to stay that? It's so far out from downtown.
But I guess the Hippodrome was there then. Was already there. So there was some activity down on that end. Yeah. Interesting. Yeah. Okay, so the natatorium has always kind of fascinated me a little bit. One of Waco's nicknames at one point was Geyser City. As dozens of other cities like to nickname themselves that had some natural springs. But I'd love to hear your story about the natatorium. And I'll say on the Waco History app, I don't know that I've mentioned in a while on the podcast, you can see some of the photographs of the natatorium, some of the postcards from this popular destination. So tell us a little bit about the natatorium.
Yeah, the natatorium, I mean, I don't have any salacious stories about it, but I just think the whole story of how Waco got to be this tourist resort was just kind of interesting. In fact, our Waco Walk this weekend is at Bell's Hill, and Captain Bell was the one who dug the well that found the artesian water that was the hot springs that became such a draw for people all over the country, really, to come to Waco to enjoy the healthful waters of the hot springs. So the natatorium was one of several spas, I guess you would call them, that people built to kind of take advantage of this craze of people being interested in hydrotherapy. So it was built by a man named Robert Parrott. He was actually an insurance guy. He also built the Provident Building, which was another big, important building at the time that's not there anymore.
Yeah, it was a huge office building.
It was the biggest office building before the Alico was built. And it was, I Yes, where was it? It was right next to where True Love bar is now, kind of catty corner.
Yeah, the stonemason or the stone merchant that did the work there, it's the same stone that's in the Cottonland Castle.
Yeah. You can tell because when you look at the pictures of it, it looks
Mm-hmm.
exactly the same.
Mm-hmm.
But anyway, the natatorium was a couple blocks down from there. It was right across the street from the Cotton Belt Depot.
Mm-hmm.
So 4th and Mary. So the Cotton Belt Depot was kind of on the downtown side, I guess you would say, of Mary, and the hotel was right across the street from that. And so the idea was that people would come in on a train, hop off, go have a bath, and then get back on the train and go back to wherever they were going. So Colonel Robert Parrott built this grand hotel, and the first hotel he built was only a 1-story hotel, but like almost every hotel back then, it burned down. And him being an insurance guy, I'm sure it was very well insured.
I bet.
And so he built a much grander hotel that was 4 stories, I think. And it had all of these. I'm looking for the description of all the fancy stuff they had. The natatorium was equipped with departments for both ladies and gentlemen to have Turkish and Russian baths, individual baths, tubs, vapor rooms, sweat and resting rooms, furnished rooms, a cafe, offices, and parlors. The pool was one of the largest in the South and featured a slide, rings, a trapeze, and water gushing from the mouth of a bronze lion. So it was pretty fancy. When you look at the pictures, it was definitely fancy. But, the water eventually, he discovered the water, I think, in 1886. And so it was popular into the 20s. But then in the 20s, we started running out because we were just like wasting it. I mean, they just were pumping water out. I mean, I guess people just didn't understand that water can run out back then. But by the 20s, it was all over with. But, I mean, there's just several just great little, like I'm looking at a postcard right now about the natatorium that says, "This is certainly a swell place to go in bathing as Waco has no beach. Tuesdays and Thursday nights are for ladies and escorts, and you can take a girl and go there and have the best time of your life." I'm like, oh, really? But then as it started to kind of peter out in the 20s, some of the ads cracked me up, So like here's one about the swimming pool, the natatorium swimming pool. "Pure water, a clean pool, bottom free of slime and dirt, and does not feel slippery under feet. No stirring of dirt to be swallowed by the bather. Hygienic in every respect."
Yeah, so they may be protesting too much.
Yeah,
right?
exactly. Exactly. But here's one over here that says 25 cents, 15 cents if you provide your own suit. So things were different then. But Waco was, Geyser City was a big deal. I mean, a couple of years ago before the pandemic, they had a article in the paper about how many people had come to Waco for Magnolia, for the silos and everything. Yeah. Like I'm thinking about like 2018 or something like that. And it was like 500,000 people had visited Waco in the month of March. Well, in 1917, 500,000 people visited Waco for the Cotton Palace.
That's right.
So, I mean,
it's remarkable to think about.
It is remarkable. Yeah. And, the hotel, one of the little clips I have in here about the Pacific Hotel, I think, is the guy who ran it was saying, yeah, we had 150 rooms, but, we were putting people in the halls and in the dining room and, any place. There was just a little place for somebody to lay down. We were renting it out. So it's kind of amazing to think about that.
What became of the natatorium? What was the fate?
It burned. It burned.
It burned.
Burned down January 1st, 1927.
Okay.
And that space is still pretty.
Yeah.
It's pretty bleak looking
It
right
is.
now, but you can still see the train tracks. The same train tracks that went right in front of the natatorium are still there. They go to that Cotton Belt bridge.
Yeah, it's supposedly we're going to have a walking solution for at some point. So you mentioned the Pacific. Where was the Pacific Hotel?
The Pacific Hotel was at the corner of it was I'm so terrible at directions. But it was right across the road from the Provident building. So it was at the corner of it was at the corner of 4th and Franklin.
Okay.
Is that right? Yeah. So the McClelland House was at 4th and Austin. Then the Roosevelt is right catty corner from that. And then on the other side of the street was the Pacific that became the Metropole. So you can probably do a better job of describing it than I am.
I mean, you start to get an idea of all these big buildings. People forget how densely developed downtown Waco was.
You could walk down 4th Street and you could go past the McClelland House Hotel, the Provident Building, the Pacific Metropole, the big, huge, beautiful post office building, the Cotton Belt Depot, and the Natatorium were all just right within 2 or 3 blocks of each other on 4th Street.
What was the Pacific? What was the years of that? Do you remember?
The Pacific was 1882 to 1936.
Okay.
And it had 2 names, the Pacific and then the Metropole. So it was big, fancy hotel. It was the first hotel to have an elevator.
Oh, my goodness.
So super fancy. And O. Henry, the short story writer who's from Austin, said that the Pacific Hotel saw more honeymooners than Niagara Falls. So
wow.
Super fancy.
The view's not as good.
No.
Yeah, I wouldn't
not as
think
good. Well, unless you like watching gunfights. I mean, they had all that kind of thing.
Yeah. But I suspect if you came for that, you'd be disappointed.
Yeah. Maybe not, though. Oh, the train, they said the train conductors used to say, 20 minutes, have dinner and see a gunfight. So it was a wild place back then.
So as you think about kind of hotels over time, you looked at a period where, a lot of change has taken place in the period you're covering. Do you think the role of kind of the hotel in the community changed over that period from what it was, say, in the 1870s to 100 years later, as you said?
Yeah, I think, for example, one of the things, the earliest hotels, one of the things that they always advertised was what they called display rooms or sample rooms. And what those were salesmen, traveling salesmen would come through town and they would rent a room in the hotel and also rent a sample room, and spread out their wares for everybody to come buy, whatever. Sewing machines, fabric, whatever they were selling. And so the hotels were much more a part of just everyday commerce of people coming in and out. And by the end of the time, the hotels were still being used for like civic meetings, like all the different clubs would meet there. And like I said, they were a social scene. Like the Raleigh Hotel had a big dance floor up on the top, open air.
Oh, on the roof?
Yeah, rooftop.
Okay.
Yeah.
Oh, wow.
And so it was a big social place to go. But it wasn't, you didn't go there to buy stuff like you did in the earliest days. So, that was a change. And then I think what happened pretty immediately after that, like I mentioned, was that highways started, cars started being more the thing. These were all hotels that were in the city where you could walk to them, and they would advertise being close to the train or stagecoaches leave regularly or, things like that. But, pretty soon after that, the highway goes around the city. And so people start staying in motels and that whole kind of lifestyle of, people lived in the hotels. When you look at the old city directories, you'll see people who lived in the hotels, and their room and board would pay for their room and food, and you just don't. I mean, I guess there are some hotels still where people live there, but you don't think of that as being so much.
Mm-hmm. Also thinking that,
Nowadays.
as you were talking, you alluded to earlier, there were these exotic places where there were kind of unknown people coming through
Right.
and
Yeah.
doing
Yeah.
interesting kind of different
Right.
things.
Yeah.
And so,
Well, and all the political,
Mhm.
I mean, William Jennings Bryan came and spoke at the Pacific Hotel,
mhm.
when he was running for president. And, there were crowds of people crowding around to hear him,
Mhm.
And the Ku Klux Klan notoriously met at the Raleigh Hotel and made their plans for running somebody for governor of Texas, so just kind of the political shenanigans.
Yeah, if
that
you
would
could
take
if you could
place.
sit in that space over time and kind of
Mhm.
watch kind of history pass you,
Right.
you would see a lot of
A
the
lot.
life. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, anything else you discovered in your deep research? Are you glad Jill asked you to do
Definitely. Because like I say, I had never thought about
Yeah.
hotels really, and there were some really neat ones here in Waco. And like you said at the very beginning, I mean, I have a little ad here that shows 19 different hotels in Waco back in the days of the Cotton Palace.
this? Mm-hmm.
Well, I was asking the city center people probably a year ago or so, and they said, well, there's 10 new hotels going up downtown and around downtown in Waco right now.
Mhm.
So, I mean, I don't know. I have kind of mixed feelings about that because
Mhm.
I'm like, holy cow, that many people are really going to come here?
Yeah.
But it's just kind of fascinating, like you say, to think about, all these people coming and mixing together in this interesting little environment. And
I was going to ask you how you picked those 5. Why'd you pick those 5?
well, when I first started looking into it, I had a much longer list, but eventually I just got to where, I can't talk about all this. I mean, I think the whole little presentation I was making was only supposed to be about 30 minutes long. I was like, I can't keep looking. And there was a pretty clear demarcation between downtown hotels at that time and then when the highway came in
Yeah.
and the motels. Because, Waco had some things to do with the motel
Yeah.
scene, too. We had some of the first motels.
Alamo Courts.
Right,
Yeah.
Alamo Courts and all
Mhm.
that. And, we had a motel on Elm Street that was in the Green Book.
The College View Court Hotel.
mhm.
Yeah.
So, but there was a pretty clear demarcation between the downtown time and the highway time.
Yeah.
So that was one way that I cut it. And then it just came down to what could I find the most information about, and the most interesting things about.
Well, it sounds like you're interested enough. You need to do the motel talk next.
Yeah, right. I'll leave that one to you. There might be a few too many clandestine meetings going on there.
I think that's bringing in a whole other conversation. Yeah. Well, Ashley, I want to thank you for joining me on the podcast. It's been a long time coming.
Yeah, thanks for having me. It was fun.
I know you're not an avid listener, as you confessed earlier, but at least listen to this one.
Oh, well, this will probably be the last one I listen to. I cannot stand hearing myself talk.
Cross the Brazos and Waco, ride hard and I'll make it by dawn.
Thanks for listening to the Waco History Podcast. Like what you heard? Subscribe, rate, and review our show on iTunes so we can reach more listeners. You can find show notes and info on every episode at wacohistorypodcast.com and more info on Waco's past at wacohistory.org. Our theme music, used with permission, is Cross the Brazos at Waco, performed by the late Billy Walker. For more info on Billy's music, go to billywalker.com. Thanks for listening. We'll see you next time.
This has been a Rogue Media podcast.